Well, let me build on that very quickly, David, because you actually touched on the policy, innovation, and partnerships, the sort of bottom sort of right-hand three going to the left of the circle. And the partnerships in particular, what struck me is, talking about bringing products back, right, to be able to remanufacture or even repair. So the essentially reverse logistics broadly. I think there are invariably challenges because of the way we've set up broadly what we call the waste management system. It's in the name. It's not a resource recovery or resource management system. Certainly innovation in terms of rethinking what that looks like matters, and then some kind of policy role, whether it's in facilitating the partnership or engaging stakeholders in another way. And there's a question in here, which is if you can think of examples where that has worked successfully, and what might be some useful drivers or features or factors that have enabled those partnerships that then that sort of close the loop essentially, have been important or have worked.
Is that a question for me? Just to go beyond the eco-design example I gave for electrical products or energy-using products.
Yeah.
So where would I look for examples of bringing companies together? I think there are two places where I see it working particularly well at the moment. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation done really very good work in bringing companies together in supply chains to design better systems and products. And the second is the World Economic Forum. I think those two places I have seen companies being prepared to share ideas and to look for better solutions driven by the objective of circular economy. And so I think you have to be very clear about why you're asking people to cooperate. All businesses are there to make money for their shareholders. That's their driver. So as you said, with the Rewiring the Economy report from Cambridge, it was to make sure that we are setting the goals very clearly. And circular economy is a very helpful one because you say to all those very bright, usually very youthful innovators, what we want you to do is to find a way of achieving a circular economy outcome. And I've seen this happen. And I think I've given you this example before when we were talking informally in the bed industry, of all places. I was at the first meeting when bed industry executives, and let's be honest, who thinks of a bed as being a place where much innovation ever happens? But it might actually in the bed, but the bed itself is hardly seen innovation in hundreds of years. It's a stuffed block. Used to be stuffed with straw, and now it's stuffed mostly with foam and springs so you can have a good night's sleep. Very important. But so I saw people saying, well, how can this possibly mean anything to us? And yet, when companies left the room to go away and speak to their mostly youthful innovators, set them those challenges, what came back, admittedly, a couple of years later, was fascinating. Because there's one company in particular based in Leeds in England called Harrison Spinks. What they did was they stretched out, they took steel springs, stretched them out in a very, very fine way to make a much softer mesh of spring, which allowed them to displace polyurethane foam. And made the product a whole lot more recyclable because they simplified the number of materials in the mattress. And a mattress that's made of steel in spring instead of polyurethane foam is much cooler to sleep on, so you can sleep better. No, that was all driven by the circular economy, but the end result was completely unpredictable. Completely. No one would have guessed that would happen. And they come up with a much better product. They're now trying to introduce that, and it's taken them to areas beyond the bedding industry. So there you are. It's an example, I suppose, of what rewiring the economy means, but applied to one product in one industry with a very successful and unexpected outcome. So I hope that gives you some idea of my enthusiasm for this space, Rajiv. I'm sorry I can't put in a remanufacturing element to that innovation. Although
I think what you also see, if you put it in a more remanufacturing example, you see that the car manufacturers are getting more and more involved in remanufacturing, and actually they never really spoke to each other about that. But you were seeing that some car manufacturers were opening their own remanufacturing plants, but they don't really have the knowledge that a remanufacturer has already remanufactures for about 40 years. So there you also see a lot of knowledge coming together, and also between the car manufacturers. I know that during Ramatec 2019, we had an OEM, a networking dinner, and there we brought together some people who have actually never spoke to each other, but just actually forcing them to come together, join together, having a dinner together. They actually shared a lot of ideas, and now you see a lot of more car manufacturers that are marketing also with their remanufacturing plants.
no, I agree with that, and I think that I particularly remember that dinner with Encory from the BMW arrangement with Encory was a very significant sharing of knowledge. And Encory have gone on, of course, not only to work with BMW, but they've encouraged Renault to...
Yeah, they announced it yesterday.
Yeah, the van. Oh, well, great. Okay, so taking back vans for reconditioning reminds me of a story from many years ago. There was a very small brand in England called Bristol. And it was only really, it was the only person who would buy a Bristol car would be how can I put it? Quite a wealthy gentleman, typically, very rarely a woman, but the car would go back for being refitted. So that's how you had the car for life, but it would be refitted. And Renault, I think, have picked up an element of that idea and applied it to vans, and I think that's great. And probably, Yorien, you in Amsterdam started a process of people talking, which has ended up in that space. So we'll never know what the truth of that is, but that's...
Let's just say that's the story, yeah.
let's make that up. We'll call that
Yeah.
No, this is good. This is good. Part of my reasoning to ask is sort of going back to talking about being at an inflection point here. I certainly see a need for creating some kind of container, an institutional container or vessel that brings people together to talk about this in a specific way, like you mentioned, David. You know, the goal needs to be clear: remanufacturing, circular economy, what the challenges are, where we want to be, and where the partnerships can emerge that allow us to get there in a quicker way without compromising on quality and also without compromising on competitiveness. I think that's going to be important to different stakeholders, but I think there is, I could be wrong. I certainly feel that that's an opportunity, and we're creating the path as we're moving forward. So it is, I think there might be some iteration and reflection needed before we being Recreate, strategically decide which way to go. But that's helpful to understand that there is, the intentionality is needed. Otherwise, you risk it sort of being haphazard, or the right connections, partnerships, and relationships just don't form. Yeah.
And I also think if you look at partnerships, looking at another way, I also believe it's important that, for example, Europe and the USA, who are a bit ahead in the rules and regulation, in return logistic, etc., that they are able to help countries who have not set the right rules and regulations yet. Because also in the webinar Wednesday, I mentioned that, for example, in China, the core, what needs to be remanufactured, is still not able to be imported and exported in and out of China. And I think that in India, that is the same case. Of course, in Europe and the USA, that is already allowed, that those countries help each other a bit.
Yeah, and on that, I thought I was particularly pleased to see at the end of February that GACERE was created, GACERE, with. Is that your dog, Yorien, trying to say?
Do you hear him? Yes. Well, I'm
nice.
actually sitting upstairs and he's downstairs. Yeah.
He's obviously very keen to get involved. So GACERE is set up between the European Commission and the UN, and lots of new members are joining it. And I think Morocco's joined, for instance, Canada, some of the Caribbean islands. So it's taking that theme that you've mentioned, Yorien, forward. So to be generous with the knowledge, and including where things have gone wrong too, I think sharing that knowledge and looking for better policy. Yeah, I'm a fan of doing so.
Great.
This is excellent conversation, and and thank you, Rajiv, for bringing forward these questions. Particularly illuminating that lens of partnerships and their consequence to all that you individually and your organizations are trying to achieve. Can I ask if we could also take a moment on the people side of this a little bit? It's inherent in all that we've discussed thus far, but kind of taking a focused look at workforce skills, the opportunity for people, because it transcends partnerships, it transcends innovation, it transcends the focus on policy. So that fabric of, people and that continuity, from where you all sit and what you've experienced, particularly this past week in a lot of conversation, but beyond that, are there continued limitations, if I could say it that way, that you all see within the industry? Is there more education? We talked a little bit about the awareness factor from a consumer point of view, but also the people who are at the forefront, the front lines of these different facets of moving the circular economy and remanufacturing industries forward, including ourselves. What do we see as the challenges? What do we see as the opportunities? Are there any limitations that you all would point to that we can also structurally begin to address over time? And the one thing I would point out there too that I was going to get to, but I'll insert it as a thread for us to consider, is the diversity, equity, and inclusion. The notion that I think most industries at this point in their evolution are fully recognizing and validating that a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture is one that's representative of creativity and innovation and this new level of thinking that can bring a new value to the enterprise. So fully addressing some of the institutional concerns that we've talked about this morning, the roadblocks to circularity and remanufacturing, having a greater wealth of people who can support new design, new thinking is a net advantage to any organization as a point of view. So I think that's a thread that's not just emerging, but I believe here to stay. But I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on the people side of this as well.
Yorien, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's okay. Let me think about it. I think if you look at
Otherwise, well, if you want to think for a moment, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. Sorry, I thought.
I know.
You look as if you were about to launch in. If I could just say this about women in particular in the remanufacturing area. What is noticeable, I think, if you would agree with this, Yorien, is the number of women in the academic area who have come to the fore in being advocates for remanufacturing. And I think, for example, I put on that list Peggy Zwolonski from Grenoble University. I think of Connie Bakker. I think at TU Delft. Forgive me if I got that wrong. I think of Nancy Bokken, who is at Maastricht University. I think of Winnie at Strathclyde University in Scotland. I think of Yan Wang at Brighton University in the UK. These are all women who are leading the case for remanufacturing. And let's be honest, if you look back at the industry as is currently described, it is mostly men, engineers, who sort of dominate the scene, and nothing wrong with that at all. But it's good to bring forward, I think, more women into this area. That's happening in the academic world. It's less obvious in industry at the moment, which is a shame. But in the policy making, right, I would also include, this is why I mentioned Stensche and Veldhoven, the voices amongst policymakers are very often women too. Where we've got a gap, I think, is in the delivery, the engine room of the circular economy, where I think we could do with more diversity. Is that fair, Yorien?
Yeah, that's. I always need to think about this for a while, because of course in remanufacturing you have a lot of different job titles, and yes, in some job titles you see more men, but on the other hand, that is not really the case. Actually, from my point of view, I normally speak to exhibitors of Ramatec, and then I speak with the marketing department. Most of them are women, so my contacts are normally women. However, if you indeed look at the more technical side, or if you walk into a remanufacturing company, there you see more men working. So yeah, it's also a bit of a difficult question, I believe. From my side, when I joined Rematec 4 years ago, it was not, and that's maybe a bit old school, but it was not really a bit of a problem that I was a woman. It was actually, everyone was always very happy to explain everything to me, and happy that I was joining the industry, and it didn't really depend women or men. I haven't really felt a discrimination or something in that kind of way, luckily. But maybe that was years ago that was the case. I don't know.